Hello, everybody, and welcome to True North Audio. I am your host, Kiko. Today, we are doing the long-awaited and long-promised follow-up to the How to Do Synthesis video. I have been trying to figure out what would be a good follow-up to this video. Initially, I thought maybe signal flow. Signal flow is very important before you get any deeper. I've also considered a video on how to choose the right synthesis for you, where to start, what's a good place to start. But I figured I would introduce everybody to at least 5 major types or methodologies of synthesis that you're going to be running into and likely using in your journey with synthesizers. Now, this does not cover every type. There are some that kind of have multiple names. There are some that you could kind of consider subcategories, or even ones that are just less common to run into, or are simple enough that when you understand these ones, you'll understand them pretty easily. So I'm not going to be talking about granular or vector. If you hear terms like East Coast versus West Coast, it's notable that they kind of have their own thing. There's a history to both, but in a broader, modern sense, they are referring a little bit to the kind of East Coast Moog style, which is mostly based in Subtractive and uses the actual keyboard. That's going to be the most common one, versus West Coast, which is usually more additive and initially did not use the keyboard but would have been more self-generative. But that's a topic for another video as well. Maybe we'll get into that in another one. It is also important to note that these are not mutually exclusive to each other either. These are usually going to be combined, and most synthesizers you're using these days are going to have little bits and pieces of every one of these that you can mix and match to taste, which is why understanding all of them will be important for your journey into synthesis. So the 5 major types of synthesis that we're going to cover are subtractive, additive, FM, wavetable, and sample-based. Starting here with subtractive, the idea of subtractive is basically to start with a more harmonically rich or complex sound. So we have this little kind of basic super saw type thing that we've built here. You take those oscillators and then you begin to use modulation and filters to subtract from them, subtract detail from them. So you basically start off with a very basic, everything's on the table, and then you start removing things from that signal. So then we'll put in a filter, for example. So now we've subtracted a lot of that high-end detail. We can subtract a little bit of that volume with the envelope here. It's a very kind of basic thing. Subtractive is basically taking something and using all the pieces of the synthesizer you have available to you to sculpt it into something a little bit more specific and a little bit more focused. Subtractive is really going to be the thing you're going to run into the most. And as I said earlier, it's not really a mutually exclusive thing. Subtractive is really going to be something you're doing even with additive, ironically enough. Additive synthesis is basically the same idea as like an old B3 organ. You could almost make the argument that an old B3 is a really early type of additive synthesizer. And I believe in some ways it probably was an inspiration for how this kind of method came along. You start off with your basic note, and then you can bring in more of the harmonic series and control how much of that you have. You can modulate that as well. I have, for example, this sort of modulator LFO kind of thing in Logic that I can assign to these different instruments. If I turn on that LFO, you'll see that this third drawbar here is bouncing back and forth. It's a really stupid example, but just a method of controlling that kind of automatically. So with an additive synthesizer, you can basically use modulation to control different parts of the harmonic series that you're adding in. So if we open up Vital and we go into, for example, we're going to go into the third oscillator here. We're going to go over to the frame that has the waveform we're actually using. In this frame here at the bottom, all these little black bars, this first row of black bars, all of that is the different parts of your harmonic series. So you have your fundamental and your second and third and so on. And what I've done with this wave is I've turned off the fundamental and the first, and I've left everything else in. And this is basically just the saw wave without the first two. Additive synthesis is basically built on the idea of taking a sine wave and adding in more of the harmonic series as you wish to control it. So again, thinking about the way that Subtractive is to start with a complex tone and shape and sculpt it to your will, Additive is to start with something very simple and build and grow it into something more complicated as you wish. So really, both of them in some ways can be seen as doing the opposite to each other, as the names would imply, but a big part of additive synthesis is actually based on the addition of the different waveforms, the addition of the different parts of the harmonic series, whereas Subtractive doesn't usually work on the principle of removing the harmonic series over time, though you can do that as well. Subtractive also kind of refers more to the filters and the envelopes and the tools. But in simple terms, the best way to think about them is that one of them is to start with as much as you can and remove things from it and sculpt it down to a more specific and focused vision. The other is to start with something very simple and begin carefully adding things to it, being able to control all those little things you're adding to it to build a more complex sound from exactly the building blocks you want. So what I've done in this case is I've built a saw wave. And with the saw wave, I have the first oscillator as the pure fundamental tone. Turn them off. You've got that. I have the first harmonic, which is basically the same tone, but twice as fast. This one has the envelope on it, which has got a slow attack, so it's kind of coming in. So that's our first, that's our second, and as I showed you earlier on the third one, I have 3 into the end. And that's where all the rich harmonic detail really starts to come in. So what I've done is I've added these envelopes to the amplifiers, and with this one, the fundamental, that comes in right away. That'll be this guy. The second harmonic comes in a little bit slower. That'll be this guy. And the third harmonic comes in with this filter, which is just a bit slower. And basically, I'm using these envelopes and these amplifiers to create oscillators that slowly richen up the sound of the saw wave. And if you look at the controls, I have added more voices to each of the layers. So the more harmonic detail you have, the more voices and a little bit wider it gets. So you basically have a sawtooth that starts off as a fundamental sine and then is going to grow into this richer, wider sound. And that's the kind of cool thing you can do with additive. Wavetable synthesis is something you're a lot more likely to come across these days. It is pretty much one of the most common and popular types of synthesis, and is a very simple kind of concept. Looking at the oscillators here in Vital again, I have wavetables on the first two, and essentially the wavetable is a waveform that changes over time depending on how you modulate it. If I have no modulation on it, it's just going to be the first frame of this wavetable. But as I play it, because I have it attached to these LFOs and envelopes, it's going to slowly move around this table this collection of waveforms. Really basic wavetable will just be like maybe a couple of waveforms, and then you are basically interpreting the change between the two as it plays through. But you can also just have high frame wavetables that can be just 250 completely different waveforms. With wavetable synthesis, you have a little bit more richness and depth, and you also have a lot more variety in the types of sounds you can make. You can use it to change the character based on the velocity, or change the character based on the note that you're playing, how far up in the scale you are. You can use it for pads, you can use it for plucks that you want to be more advanced and interesting. If you were a fan of dubstep back in the day, you're probably going to recognize a lot of the kind of wobble-based noises. That's usually based on basic wavetables. FM synthesis, one we're going to get into later, that can be done, or at least baked into a wavetable. Same thing with additive. You can basically bake all the harmonics into a wavetable and then just cycle through the wavetable to get the different harmonics you want. Wavetable is really just about how you voice the oscillator and what options you have in the oscillator voicing. And it's, again, pretty common these days. Now, FM synthesis gets a little bit more mathematical. It's a similar idea to additive in some ways, and there could even, again, be an argument that FM is a type of additive synthesis. But in short, what you're doing is modulating the frequency or phase of your waveform using other waveforms, more or less. Technically, FM, or frequency modulation, is just any modulation of the frequency of the waveform. So if I started here with this basic sine wave, and I just took this LFO, dragged it on the pitch here, what that LFO is doing is FM synthesis. Now, it's a really dumb example and it sounds stupid, but that's the idea. That's really all you're doing with it. But the method to do it, and different synthesizers will do it differently. In stuff like Vital or even Serum, you actually have an effect that you can put on, which you have in this area here. And that effect actually allows you to FM one oscillator off another oscillator in your engine directly. In short, what you're doing is the same thing we just did with the LFO, but because you're using one of the actual tonal waves, one of the faster moving sine waves, you're getting an effect that happens quickly enough to give you a very kind of unique and different type of sound. So this is a very basic patch. This is going to be a linear patch, basically meaning that the carrier and modulator are in a linear relationship to each other. The modulator is also going to be pitched along with the carrier, so they're going to have a relationship to each other that is also directly related to their frequency as it is played up and down the scale. Quick understanding too, the types of oscillator you have in FM synthesis are going to be your carrier and your modulator. The carrier is the one you hear. The modulator is the one that is affecting the pitch or the frequency of the one that you are actually hearing. Like I said, think about it like a really fast LFO. And with the right synthesizer, you can just use a really fast LFO for the same effect. So for this one, we're going to use oscillator 2, which is turned all the way down. You cannot hear oscillator 2, you can only hear oscillator 1. We are going to use that to modulate oscillator 1. If I turn it off, just a basic sine wave. Turn it on, it's a little bit richer and a little more kind of fun and funky. But if I take oscillator 3 here and then begin to modulate oscillator 2, then you can get a little bit more of a complex noise. And in a way, like I said, you can think of that as an additive synthesis. And so you can use FM to make a lot of like really weird alien noises. If you have the ability, you can bake in that kind of harmonic relationship into a waveform and then use that in a sweep. You can also modulate with more unusual and complex sounds. So I could turn this first modulator into this kind of weird looking saw wave. Get really funky with that. And of course, it's really popular to kind of actually modulate the amount of FM. So if I take another envelope here, turn it into a little sort of pluck. You can add that in to create a little just kind of a moment where you have a little more detail going on, but let it fall out. You can also FM things that are not sine waves. But the more harmonic detail is in the operator or the carrier, the kind of uglier and weirder your FM sound is actually going to get. But you can do a ton of crazy stuff with FM. In simple terms, have sine wave, add sine waves to it, add other waves to it, makes it more complicated. So another really cool type of FM synthesis you can do is exponential. So as I stated earlier, the linear FM is based on the idea that the modulators are following the pitch of the main carrier. So you have a sort of linear relationship between the harmonics that each is playing. It's a ratio type thing. In this example, what you actually have is an exponential relationship, being that I have this basic patch. So I have my waveform, my oscillator into my envelope, and amplifier and out. So when I play that, you get a really basic sort of pluck sound, and this pluck is just the sine wave pitched. So I'm going to take this second oscillator here. This one I'm not going to feed any kind of pitch information into, so it is basically going at all times at a single frequency. Now if I take that and put it into the FM mod, the frequency modulation, and I have that turned up a little, you get kind of more of a like atonal bell type noise. Try not to fat finger it too much, but basically the frequency of the modulator remains the same, and so what it does to the carrier is going to be different for every single note because the relationship of the frequency modulation changes every time you play it. Some of the notes are going to be a little bit less pleasant to listen to, but this is good for trying to recreate more atonal types of sounds. That's the same kind of principle that you have when you're working with bells or any kind of like metal pitched instrument. You might have a little bit of that atonal sound to it. Kind of in a similar way to the thing I was talking about with the tongue drums in my sample editing video, the way that the tongue drum has a sort of resonant frequency that's a fixed pitch based on all the other tongues on the drum. So it's a different relationship every time you play it. What's happening in that tongue drum to give it that character is basically this sort of FM synthesis, but in a physical form. And finally, to close this off, we're going to go into Pigments here, just because I like the sample engine it has, and talk about sample-based synthesis. And sample-based synthesis, in some ways, is also just sampling, but in this case, it's not taking a sample and playing with it as much as using a sample as your oscillator. And you can do this in Vital and Serum and a lot of other ones as well. But I just think that this plays very nicely and is very clear in Pigments. So you'll see I have these other oscillators turned off. I just have two, which is the sample engine. It's got this little E piano. So I can take this start and I can go and say, I want this quieter part. Or if you have a sample that's like part of a song, something like the example of back in the day when people would rip loops off of vinyl, you could take kind of a melody from something and you could tell the start and end time to be one note from that melody and then use the engine of the synthesizer to turn that into your sound. And you can, of course, layer in sounds. Keeping the sample engine on, let's put something else in. It's a vibraphone now. Vibraphones are cool, but let's see what we got. I'm going to turn off the granular engine I had playing in there. You can tell this one's kind of a whole bunch of things going on. So I'll drag that start over to this louder part. And that can be kind of a texture. Put it into filter 2, turn the filter down a little bit more for some of that high-end stuff, and now it can kind of... And with sample-based, you can kind of change the loop point. You can have it ping-pong on itself. With granular, you basically create more of those start heads, and each one of them can go wherever you tell it to go, different places. Let's go to the music box. You'll notice when I turn on granular, if you look at this, it's all kind of bouncing around a lot. There's a lot going on here. Basically, I use the granular to create a little bit of chaos on this one. So you get that kind of crackling almost going on because there's a bunch of different playheads and it's just jumping back and forth real quick. And so you can use that as a form of texture, but you can also use that as a form of delay if you slow it down enough. And you can also use it as a sort of space and time effect if you'd like. So if you ever hear people talking about granular synthesis, for example, it's basically a sort of subdivision of sample-based synthesis that gets a little bit more complex. It gets a little more grainy. I hope that video was helpful. If you have any questions, feel free to ask. I'll try to answer them to the best of my ability. I am not the greatest expert of all in any of this, but hopefully I gave you at least a basic enough understanding for this stuff to make sense. There are plenty of other resources on all of this from much smarter people than me. If you are interested, Ben Jordan, Venus Theory are a couple that I recommend. Andrew Huang talks about some of this stuff fairly often. There's plenty of other great videos that really go into depth with any of these. And if there's any one of these you want to learn more about, let me know and I can try to put together a video that really dives deep into these when I get through some of the other basic synthesis. Realistically though, like I said, none of these are mutually exclusive ideas. This gives you some kind of building blocks in the same way that oscillators and envelopes and everything will. But truthfully, to get the kinds of sounds you want, don't really feel that you have to be completely committed to one or the other. Just start playing around with everything. And if you think that X sounds really cool with Y, just do it. There's no wrong answers. It's one of those, I think as Warren Hewart puts it often, if it sounds good, it is good. And I think that principle, especially in synthesis, is really important to keep in mind. Synthesis nerds, especially back in the early days, were basically dudes who were finding new ways to make noise and new ways to make noise sound like other noise. There's really not much of a wrong answer other than just explore. Explore, 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 and don't let people tell you that you have to be too beholden to any one rule. Just make what sounds good.